Hey everyone, it's Anthony from Pretty Printer here. In today's video, I'll be showing you how to convert some HTML into a Flask-WTF form. So by that I mean converting this form, which is just pure HTML at the moment, into a Flask-WTF enabled form. So this is what it looks like. It's mostly Bootstrap, well it's all Bootstrap, and it has multiple divs that hold each form element. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to convert each form element one by one into its Flask-WTF equivalent. So we should end up with the same form, but with less code here and the ability to initialize the form on your server and process it as well. So I have a few imports ready. I have string field, password field, text area field, radio field, and select fields ready. I'm not going to focus on the validators, so I'll just use input required. But with those 5 fields, I can convert these 5 form elements because I have a text, a password, a text area, a radio, and a select. So I have the macro from last time. I'll be modifying this slightly to support some of the fields, and I'll have to create a new one to support the radio buttons. So to get started, the first one that I'll convert is the email one. So what I want to do is I want to first create a better render field macro that will generate pretty much all of these elements, all except for one. So I won't be generating the radios with the same macro because it's a little different how it's set up. But the email, password, text area, and select can all be generated from the same macro. So I'll do that here, and I'll continue calling it render field, but instead of having this inside of it, I'll change this completely. So remember, inside the macro, you can make it anything you want. So that's what I'm going to do. So let's see. My form, I'm going to take one div and move it over to the macro, and I'll modify it so it's actually dynamic. So I have a div, and then inside the div, I have a label, and I have another div that holds the actual field. So I want to keep the div just to support Bootstrap. And then I want to make some other things dynamic. So the first thing that should be dynamic is the input field. So the input email, this is for something here, that should be changed to support whatever field name is being called. So I'll change this to field.name, which means that whatever name of the field I pass in, that's going to be the ID for the label and eventually the input, which I'll change in a moment. I'll have the class be exactly the same. And then the text here, so instead of having just email, I'll have it be dynamic. And I'll change it to the field labels text. So if the field label says email, email will show up here. If it says password, password will show up here. Next, I'm going to modify this to actually display the field itself. So instead of having input here, what I'll do is I'll simply display the field. So field, and I'm calling the field so I can pass in some extra arguments. So one thing that I want to pass in is a class, and for class, the parameter name is class underscore, and this is just an HTML class. So form control. So Bootstrap styles still work. And then I'm going to pass in any additional arguments, and they're going to be keyword arguments. And then I'll just pass in the save filter. Underneath this, I can add the errors. So I'll create an unordered list. And I'm going to loop over whatever errors I have. So for an error in field.errors, in 4, I'm going to have a list item with red text, color red, and then it's going to display whatever the error is. So this error comes from the loop, and that's it. So this macro here should be enough to display my fields. So now I'll go over to the backend, and I will create the class. I already have it created. It's called my form. and I'm going to create the first field, which is the email field. So it's going to be a string field. I'm going to call it email for the label. And then the validators, I'll just have it be input required. So input required, that's it. So now I'll generate this form. So form is my form, and I'll pass it to my template. Okay, so now what I want to do is I'll go back to the template, and let's go right above it. I'm going to add the field. So what I'm going to do is use that macro that I just created to render the field that I'm interested in. So to do that, it's pretty simple, which is from the last video that I have in this series. It's going to be render field, and then the field is going to be form.email. And I want a placeholder for the form so it matches. So we see here I have the email placeholder in there. I'm going to pass in a placeholder, and it's going to be the label text. So form.email.label.text, and that's just simply going to display email. So I'll save that, and remember this placeholder is being passed in as a keyword argument here, so it gets added to this field when it's generated. So if I refresh this, render field is undefined. That means I forgot to import it. So at the top of my HTML file, I'll from _ render field import render field. Okay, so let's try this again. Okay, so now we see I have two email fields, and they look like exact duplicates. So that means that the one that I'm generating works. And what I'll do is I'll remove the one that is static. So I can take this away, save it, and then I'll end up with one email field. So this email field is now being generated by Flask-WTF instead of just being pure HTML. So I'll do the same thing for the other fields. So I'll create a password field. So password field. I'll just call it password. Validators, it's going to be input required. Okay, so I'll do the exact same thing. Where's my form? I'll render the field, form.password, placeholder. It's going to be just like the email field above it, except it's for the password. Save that, and now I should see two password fields, which I do, so I can take away the static one. And then I'll do the same thing for the text area. So text area, I'll call it text area field, text area, and I won't make it required. So I'll go back to my form and render that. Form.text area. I won't have a placeholder because it's kind of weird in a text area field. So now let's see if I have two text areas. I do, and I don't care too much about this block of text under here, but I suppose I can leave it if I wanted to, but it's not a big deal. Okay, so now I should have one text area field. And now for the radio buttons, that's where it gets a little tricky. So I can't use the radio buttons in the same way that I use these first three fields because there are a potentially endless number of options. So what I have to do is loop over those options and display them one by one in the macro. So what I'll do is I'll create a new macro that is just for the radio fields. So I'll call this render radio fields, passing in the field, and this should have macro in the beginning of it. I can't spell macro. In macro. Okay, so it's going to be pretty similar to the above. So I'll copy and paste some common elements. So it's going to have that form group div. It's also going to have this label. And since it's not a text field, I won't use the for. So I'll get rid of the for. And then it's going to have the div here that holds the actual field element. Okay, so now that I have this, what I'll do is I'll loop over the subfields in this particular field, because for radio buttons, they have subfields. So because you can have, let's say, 10 radio buttons, then each individual radio button will be a subfield. So I'll simply loop over the subfield. And when you have fields that support subfields, instead of getting one element like you do here, you'll get a list of them. So you can actually loop over. So it'll make more sense once I write the loop. So for subfield in field, in for, I'm going to create a div, and that div is class radio, right? Yeah, div class radio. Once again, just to support the styling. Close out the div. And then the way it's set up is, I believe it's a label and then the actual field. So to do that, I'll write label and then close out the label. And then I can simply put the subfield in here. So subfield, which will render the radio button first, because the radio buttons comes first. And then after the radio button comes the actual text of the field. So subfield, and then subfield.label.text, in a similar way to what was going on above. So I'll save that, and then I'll go over to my form, and I'll actually add the options for the radio. So let's call this radio. It's going to be a radio field, and I'll call it radios. And then with a radio field and a select field, which you'll see next, you have to supply choices. So it's called choices. You're providing a list of tuples. So the first part of the tuple will be the actual value of the option, and then the second part of the tuple will be the text that gets displayed. So I believe it's simply just option 1 and option 2. So the first tuple, option 1, and then the second part of the tuple is option 1 is this, and then the second tuple, option 2, and then what does the text say? Option 2 can be something else. Option 2 can be something else. So that's it. And then when I go back to my form, I have to import that. Where is it? Wrong one. Import render radio fields. And then down here, I'll simply render the radio fields. So render radio fields. Was it fields or fields? Yeah, fields. Form.radios. And now if I refresh the page, I should see 2 sets of radio buttons. And I don't. It's because I have a syntax error somewhere. In macro looks fine. Let's see. Did I neglect to close something? In for. So what does the error say? Encounter unknown tag subfield. Oh, I forgot the for here. So for subfield in field. So now if I do this again, and then what did I call it? I called it radios. So I forgot the S. Let's try this one more time. Okay. So now we see I have 2 sets of radios. And I can easily put a default on that, because right now the second set of radio buttons that I added doesn't have a default. So it's simply the default parameter. So default is going to be option 1. So I'll save that. And then I see option 1 is checked. If I change the default to option 2, then it should move to option 2. It does. So I'll change it back to option 1, and I'll remove the HTML for the radios. So it's all of this right here. And surprisingly, the render field works just fine for selects. So render field form.selects is what I'll call it. And all I have to do is actually create the selects in the same way that I created the radios. So this is going to be selects. Let me move this over. Select field, select, and it has choices. And here the choices are simply 1 through 5. So I don't want to write all of them, so I'll just do 3. So 1 and 1, 2 and 2, and then 3 and 3. So I'll save that and let's see if it runs. Okay, so now I have 2 sets of selects. I have one that goes 1 through 3, and I have another that goes 1 through 5. So now I have my form converted. So I need to add the cross-site request forgery token. So I'll add that simply at the top. So where's the beginning of the form? Form.csrf token. And then I'll put a method and an action on this. So the method is going to be post, and the action will simply be the index. So now what I'll do is I'll put the validation part in my route. So if form.validate on submit, so validate on submit, what I want to do is pass in the values from the form to another template so I can view them. So I have this results template that I started working on. In here in the div, I'll actually display the results. So first, before doing that, I'll return render template. Return render template. Results.html is the name. And then it's going to take in 5 values. So email, form.email.data, password is form.password.data, text area, form.textArea, data, radios is form.radios.data, and finally selects is form.selects.data. So I don't want to do any actual processing. I just want to see the results. So in the results here, what I'll do is I'll create a header for each one. It's going to be 5. And I'll say email is email here. And then I'll just copy and paste this. So password is going to be equal to the password. Let's see what's next. Text area. Text area. Radios. Radios. And then finally selects. Selects. So this is just going to mirror back whatever I put into the form. So let's try this out. That should be enough code. So here's my generated form. So none of this is just raw HTML anymore. It's actually generated by Flask-WTF. So I'll put john@me.com, secret for the password. This is a text area. This is a new line. I'll select option 2 and I'll select number 3. So let's see what happens when I submit. I see john@me.com, secret. This is a text area. This is a new line, option 2 and 3. So we see that the form is getting submitted correctly, and the data that I put into the form I can actually see right here. So of course you wouldn't actually do something like this. You would process that data in some way, but you see how easy it is to convert a Bootstrap form over to a Flask-WTF form. And it's basically just using the macros. So as long as you know what you want each individual field to look like, then you can write a macro to generate those elements in the form. And then you can process the form like you do in any other Flask-WTF application, and it makes things so much simpler. So that's what I want to show you in this video. I want to show you how to convert a design form into something that you can use in Flask-WTF. And as you can see, it's not too difficult. So if you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed to my channel already, please subscribe. And make sure you check out prettyprinted.com for Flask courses. I'm starting to add Flask courses on there, so check that out. I have both free courses and premium courses. And of course, if you have any questions about this video, just leave a comment down below. So thank you for watching this video, and I will talk to you next time.